So in this video, I'm going to debate Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion. I did invite Richard to a in-person debate, and hopefully someday he'll take me up on the offer to have an in-person debate. Um, Nonetheless, in absence of Richard, I've taken three quotes from his book that pretty much represent, a summary of his major problems with God. And then I have used my own book, The God Vacuum, written in 2021, to refute the same points from his book. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. Without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the main arguments from The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, 2001. The first quote being, quote, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully," end quote. So you can obviously see here, Richard Dawkins is no fan of the Christian God or the God of the Bible. What's the counter argument from my book to this? Well, it's very simple. My quote, referring to the Old Testament, quote, "In the southern United States, slaves were in bondage by their so-called Christian slave masters, while the slaves sang songs in the fields about Moses letting his people go, which used scripture to call out the hypocrisy of their slave owners," end quote. Okay, so what does this all mean? The Old Testament, despite all of the hate that it gets, is probably the most woke, progressive, social justice book of the ancient world. What do I mean by that? Well, slavery was ubiquitous throughout the entire planet in the time of Moses and the Old Testament. And there is no other book in antiquity that condemns the institution of slavery stronger than the Old Testament and the God of the Old Testament, who condemned slavery, and not just condemned slavery in Egypt, but rained hellfire and pestilence and plague upon Pharaoh until he let the Jewish people go, until he released them out of bondage. So the God of the Old Testament, the Christian God, poured out his wrath upon the Pharaoh because of slavery. So the God of the Old Testament is extremely enlightened, especially compared to that time period. Because if we look at every other civilization of the ancient world, the Romans had slaves. The sub-Saharan Africans had slaves as well as the Northern Africans. The Chinese had slaves. The South Americans had slaves. The Central Americans had slaves. Everybody had slaves. And in the time of the Old Testament, there was no civilization in the entire world that even questioned slavery at all. It was just like another day, another day in the ancient world. I mean, the Vikings had slaves. And all of these cultures, whether Viking, African, South American, Asian, Middle Eastern, they were brutal to their slaves and no one cared. Life was cheap. And the fact that the Christian God in the Old Testament commanded his servant Moses to tell Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go, let them out of slavery, and rained hellfire and plagues upon Egypt until the Pharaoh submitted to letting the slaves go, was the first example in ancient history of a God ever condemning slavery. And not just condemning slavery, but pouring out his wrath upon the institution of slavery. And as I point out in my book, fast forward a couple thousand years to the United States in the 1800s, when we still had slavery, and the slaves of the southern United States were still calling out the hypocrisy of their so-called Christian slave owners who own slaves, invoking Moses, who told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." So even by the 19th century, before the Civil War ended, we still hadn't caught up to the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament condemned slavery thousands of years before in Egypt. And so we still hadn't caught up to that by the 19th century in the United States. That is the sign of revealed truth. That truth is revealed by God far beyond the knowledge or ability of humans. And so the God of the Old Testament, the Christian God who condemned slavery, gave us that as revealed truth thousands of years before modern social justice was ever even invented. So you could say that the Old Testament is the most progressive, woke, enlightened social justice book of the ancient world without a doubt. So despite all of the hatred of the Old Testament, you can see these examples of the enlightenment that God reveals in the Old Testament. So again, I don't see what Richard Dawkins, his issue with the Old Testament. It's far more progressive. In fact, there's still slavery in the world and human trafficking. And so we still haven't caught up to the Old Testament. In 2023, we are still catching up to the Old Testament. So I would have to completely counter Richard Dawkins' point about the God of the Old Testament. He's just completely wrong about the God of the Old Testament and the Old Testament. I don't even think he's ever read it. I mean, it's obvious to me that Richard Dawkins hasn't even read the Old Testament or hasn't read it in context. The next quote from Richard Dawkins' book, quote, "The feeling of awed wonder that science can give us in one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable," end quote. Okay, so Richard Dawkins, and not just in his book, but in his debates, he's constantly making the argument that atheism owns science, and that all the great atheists are all the great scientists are atheists. That's just not true. It's completely not true. And I'm going to start rebutting that point with Blaise Pascal, who I invoke in my book. And Blaise Pascal, French philosopher, mathematician, scientist, inventor, and theologian, contends that, quote, "The infinite abyss can only be filled by an infinite and immutable object. That is to say, only God himself," end quote. And Blaise Pascal, scientist, mathematician, philosopher, theologian, he said accurately that we can try to satisfy the heart with all kinds of things, but the only thing that will truly satisfy the human heart is God. And it's not just in the 1600s you had theist scientists, but also even in modern times, like the great Nikola Tesla was an Orthodox Christian as well. And here is the quote from Nikola Tesla. Quote, "The gift of mental power comes from God, divine being. And if we concentrate our minds on that truth, we become in tune with this great power," end quote. So again, Nikola Tesla, arguably the greatest inventor of the 20th century, is just one of many, many scientists that invoke God. And Tesla credits God with the gift of mental power. And he talks about great power. And he invokes great power in connection with God, with meditating on God. And this is a suppressed truth that many atheists like Richard Dawkins try to suppress. But actually, it's when the great musicians, artists, scientists meditate on God that they can get downloads of information from God. Tesla was no different. Einstein, he has a lot of God quotes, a lot. You can just Google God quotes by Albert Einstein and you'll see a bunch. And he was into visualization and I believe Einstein was also tapping into the power of God as well. So Tesla talks about God being the source of great power. And if we become in tune with that, we can tap into the great power of God. I could go on, but it's just the notion that atheists like to assert that atheism owns science is just completely false. I'll leave it at that because you can do all of your own research to validate that point, and there's a mountain of evidence to counter that with all of the theist scientists and inventors and musicians and anyone who's ever given good gifts to humanity ultimately would credit those gifts to the one true God, tapping into God's power. Let's go ahead and take another quote from Richard Dawkins. Quote, imagine with John Lennon a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusaders, no witch hunts, no shiny suited, buffant-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people of their money. God wants you to give till it hurts. End quote. Oh, that's just so enlightening, Richard Dawkins. Oh, you're just onto something there. That's just completely false. Religion has done far more for humanity than anything that has ever caused negative. And even he's, seems to be picking on Muslims there, seems to be a little bit Islamophobic, but, 99.99% of Muslims are just hardworking people that make the world a better place. And so trying to somehow invoke 9/11 to make his point, I think was very tasteless, and I completely disagree with his sentiment. But what would be my counter? Quote, Jesus had no power, no money, no armies, but somehow overcame all the odds and ended up conquering the Roman Empire with love, end quote. So this is the point, the counterpoint I would make to Richard's point that all religion has caused all the ills of the world. Look at Jesus Christ. Look at how barbaric the world was before Jesus. Human life had no value. And if you read the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides in ancient Greece, where you had the Athenians and the Spartans in this war, and they had all these city-states, they basically said, from that book, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So, for example, when the Athenians invaded the island of Milos, they killed all the men of military age and committed atrocities, raped the women, and sold the women and children into slavery. And again, they said the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. So in the ancient world, there was no humanity, there was no mercy. The Romans were merciless. They would watch people get eaten alive by animals in the Colosseum. It was entertainment for them. There was no human value, value for human life. There was no attention on the meek, the humble, the sick, the young, women and children. It was Christ who brought attention to the sick, the humble, the weak, women and children, the salt of the earth. No one promoted human rights more than Jesus Christ, particularly in the ancient world, but I would also argue in the modern world. So the idea that all the ills of the world are caused by religion is nonsense. And in fact, if you watch a documentary by Jonathan Phillips of the University of London History Department called Ancient Roads, From Christ to Constantine, he actually talks about why so many Europeans converted, or so many people in the Roman Empire, not just Europe, but the Roman Empire, including the Middle East and Africa, converted to Christianity was because of the humanity of Christians. Christians would go around and build hospitals. They would take care of the sick, the weak, the people who were thrown out in the street, who were dying of disease. The Christians would take them in, even if they were not Christians, and they would show them mercy and kindness. And so Christianity is credited with, hospital building schools, building, things for humanity, philanthropy. And so this is why so many people of the Roman Empire became Christians, because when everyone else had thrown someone out into the street and they would be dying in the street, it would be the Christians who would take them in, who would heal them, who would heal them of their sicknesses, who would feed them, would clothe them, would care for them. And so I would argue that religion has done far more good for humanity than ever it's done bad for humanity. And all we have to do is look at the atheistic regimes of the 20th century, the Soviets, the communist Chinese, North Koreans, Cambodians, who killed millions and millions of people and showed no mercy and no compassion at all. And those were atheists. These so-called enlightened atheists had no mercy, no compassion, no forgiveness, and killing on an industrial scale. So I would take the Christians of the Roman period that converted the Roman Empire to Christianity over your atheist communist regimes of the 20th century any day, Mr. Dawkins. So you're just wrong. You're just flat out wrong. So in conclusion, Richard Dawkins is just completely wrong on all accounts. He's completely wrong. He's completely mischaracterized the Christian God. He's completely mischaracterized the Bible, and he's defamed and defrauded all of the good things that religion, particularly Christianity, has done for the world. And again, Richard, it's an open invitation to you to debate me in person. I would love the opportunity. Okay, thanks for watching this video. I look forward to your comments. Please like, please subscribe, and please share with a friend.